What happens when a doctor uses their position to exploit a patient? And what if the law almost lets them get away with it? In 1992, the Supreme Court of Canada heard Norberg versus Wynrib, a case about addiction, power, and consent in healthcare. This case forced Canada to rethink what consent really means and whether vulnerable patients can truly give it. This is a short video breaking down what the case means for patients and for our healthcare system. Let's start with the facts. Laura Norberg developed an addiction to Fiduciary, a prescription painkiller containing a barbiturate. She obtained it from various doctors until eventually turning to Dr. Wynrib, a physician in his 70s. Once he became aware of her addiction, instead of offering treatment, Dr. Wynrib exploited her vulnerability, suggesting a sex for drugs arrangement. Over the course of more than a year, Norberg submitted to unwanted sexual acts in exchange for pills. She eventually sought help at a rehab center and then sued Dr. Wynrib, claiming sexual assault, breach of fiduciary duty, and negligence. The case went through the courts in British Columbia and eventually landed at the Supreme Court of Canada. The justices agreed that Norberg's consent wasn't legally valid. There was a clear power imbalance, and Wynrib abused his position as a physician. But the court split on how to frame the wrongdoing. While some justices argued for liability under battery, the majority found Dr. Wynrib civilly liable for breaching his fiduciary duty, meaning he violated the trust and loyalty owed to his patient. Norberg versus Wynrib forces us to think differently about what consent actually means. In tort law, consent is only valid when it's given freely, voluntarily, and without coercion. The court recognized that addiction, like Norberg's, places a person in a state of desperation where free choice becomes impossible. The court described the relationship as one of power dependency, and in such a relationship, consent isn't just about saying yes, it's about whether the person had any real choice. This case affirms that individuals in vulnerable situations, especially in healthcare, must be protected from exploitation, even when their consent appears outwardly voluntary. If your doctor is the one controlling your access to medication, and that medication is the very thing you're dependent on, then the law now recognizes you're not truly free to choose. For the healthcare system, Norberg versus Wynrib was a turning point. It reinforced the idea that the doctor-patient relationship is a fiduciary one, built on trust and defined by a duty to act in the patient's best interests. It also emphasized that power in medicine must be restrained by law. Since this ruling, regulatory colleges like the College of Physicians and Surgeons have strengthened professional boundaries, especially around sexual misconduct. The case also challenged the courts to think more deeply about how addiction, vulnerability, and power intersect, not just in criminal law, but in tort and equity too. Some critics say the SCC didn't go far enough, that Wynrib should have been held criminally liable for assault, but the precedent remains powerful. Professionals who exploit vulnerable patients can be held accountable even if physical force wasn't used. Norberg versus Wynrib isn't just about a bad doctor. It's about how power, trust, and vulnerability collide in healthcare. It shows us that true consent isn't possible without freedom, that fiduciary duty isn't optional, and that the law can evolve to protect those who need it most. Just in case you or someone you know ever feels powerless in a medical relationship, know this: you have rights. You deserve care that protects you, not care that takes advantage of you. But the law isn't perfect, and cases like this remind us that true justice doesn't just depend on rules, it depends on us holding power to account. The courts may have recognized the harm done to Laura Norberg, but the fact that it took years and multiple appeals to reach that point speaks volumes. Patients like Laura often suffer in silence, unsure if anyone will believe them or if the system will listen. That's why this case matters, not just because of the legal precedent it set, but because it forces us to ask who gets to define consent and how we protect people when trust is broken. If we want a healthcare system that's truly safe, ethical, and just, we can't just rely on individual cases. We need better policies stronger education, and a culture that refuses to accept silence as consent. Justice, in this case, was slow, but it wasn't silent, and that makes all the difference.